38 children entered Rissberg Castle in Temeria, centuries before Geralt of Rivia would walk the path. They came from towns whose names no longer matter, carried in carts or dragged by hands they did not recognize, purchased from families who could not feed them, or taken from families who had no say in the matter. The youngest was perhaps 7, the oldest 12. The mages who gathered them, Cosimo Malaspina, his student Alzur, their apprentice Idarran, had promised kings an army, enhanced humans capable of hunting the creatures that regular soldiers could not kill. Witchers they would be called, though the word meant nothing yet. Just a theory written in alchemical formulas, diagrams of viral vectors, notes on hormonal cascades that might, if the calculations held, transform ordinary children into something capable of surviving what no human should face. 38 children went into the trials. 5 boys walked out. The rest became names in ledgers that later generations of mages would prefer not to open. Bodies disposed of in ways the records do not specify. Screams that echoed through stone corridors until they stopped. This was the cost of creating the first Witchers. This was the mathematics that kingdoms decided they could not afford. This was the foundation upon which Alzur would build a legacy that outlasted empires. Spells still cast, monsters still hunted, consequences still unfolding centuries after he died. There were names that survived, not many. The conjunction had happened 15 centuries before Geralt of Rivia walked the path. But Witchers, the mutations, the trials, the transformation of children into monster hunters, those came much later, centuries after the conjunction had already reshaped the world. Centuries of kingdoms rising, falling, burning before someone decided that humanity needed defenders who were no longer quite human. 3 names remained from that later work, from the time when transformation became deliberate rather than catastrophic: Cosimo Malaspina, Idarran of Ulivo, and Alzur. The mage Ortolan, ancient beyond measure, spoke these names to a white-haired witcher centuries after the work was done. Ortolan, who had watched empires collapse and magic twist into new forms, who had created the elixir that trapped him in a failing body for longer than memory could easily hold. Ortolan knew. For it was Cosimo Malaspina, the old mage had said, and after him his student Alzur, yes, Alzur, who created the Witchers. They invented the mutation owing to which men like you were bred. 3 names, 3 architects of transformation, but only one name echoed through the centuries with real weight, carried forward not just in scholarly texts but in spells still cast, in creatures still hunted, in children still taken. Only one name became synonym for creation itself, both wondrous and terrible: Alzur. The world did not need Witchers when Alzur was born, or rather, accounts differ on what the world needed. The conjunction of the spheres had opened wounds in reality itself, approximately 1,500 years before Alzur's time. Through those wounds came creatures that had no business existing in a world of flesh and stone, and reasonably ordered seasons, ghouls that fed on the dead, vampires that walked in forms both beautiful and monstrous, neckers breeding in tunnels beneath human settlements, drowners pulling fishermen into shallow water. The elder races, elves, dwarves, gnomes, who had built civilizations on the continent long before humans arrived, had endured this new reality. They had adapted, they had survived, though the cost was written in ruined cities and forests that no longer felt safe after dark. Then came humans, also refugees of the conjunction, their own world destroyed behind them. Humans who reproduce faster than elves could track. Humans who spread across the continent like a flood seeking new channels. Humans who discovered they could touch the chaos that the conjunction had made more prominent in the world, could shape it, could wield magic in ways that made them dangerous despite their brief lives. By the time Alzur was born, records placed this approximately 9 to 10 centuries before Geralt of Rivia's era, in what historians would later categorize as the 10th century of human reckoning. Humans had already conquered most of the continent. They had built kingdoms. They had crowned kings. They had established the Brotherhood of Sorcerers to regulate magic and maintain influence over those kings. They had pushed the elves into smaller territories, hunted them, married them, killed them, depending on the decade and the region and the whim of whoever held power, but the monsters remained. Fragmentary accounts from survivors of that era, passed down through oral tradition before being committed to written chronicles, many of which have themselves degraded or been lost, describe villages emptied by creatures that appeared at twilight. The incompleteness of these records stems partly from the chaos of the post-conjunction period, when record-keeping took second place to survival, and partly from deliberate destruction by later authorities who found some accounts too disturbing or politically inconvenient to preserve. What remains often comes from sources whose reliability cannot be independently verified, ballads that might conflate multiple events, chronicles copied generations after the original, testimony filtered through unknown numbers of retellings. Accounts speak of caravans lost between cities, found weeks later as scattered bones. One record, preserved in a damaged form by unknown scribes, mentions a town near the Pontar that simply ceased to exist after something came out of the forest. No survivors, no bodies, just empty buildings and bloodstains that couldn't be washed away. Humans were poorly equipped for this reality. Their swords were made for fighting other humans. Their armor was designed for battles fought in daylight, with rules, with tactics that assumed your enemy would die when pierced in the right place. Monsters did not always follow those assumptions. Some creatures could regenerate from wounds that should have been fatal. Others were immune to steel entirely, their bodies rejecting the metal as if it were water sliding off oil. Certain beasts could entrance humans with a glance, turn them against each other, make them walk willingly into jaws that would end them. And the truly dangerous ones, the ones that wore human faces, that could think and plan and deceive, those could not be defeated by strength alone. The kingdoms needed a solution. The mages who advised those kingdoms recognized the scope of the problem, and a small group of those mages, renegades, according to some accounts, visionaries according to others, decided to create that solution themselves. Whether this decision was driven by genuine concern for human survival, or by the ambitions of men who wanted to be remembered as creators of something unprecedented, remains unclear. Historical records from this period are sparse. The mages involved did not write manifestos explaining their reasoning. What survives are fragments, a line in a damaged text here, a reference in a later chronicle there, and the testimony of Ortolan himself, centuries after the work was done. What can be stated with confidence is this: approximately 3 to 4 centuries before Geralt of Rivia would hunt monsters across the northern kingdoms, at Rissberg Castle in Temeria, the mage Alzur and his collaborators began experimenting with mutations that would alter human children into something capable of hunting monsters. The exact year is uncertain. Chronicles from this period are fragmentary and dating systems varied between kingdoms, but the work happened during an era when humanity had already established kingdoms, yet still struggled desperately against the creatures the conjunction had left behind. Rissberg Castle stood in the northern reaches of Temeria, built on land where ley lines of magical energy converged. The castle itself predated human occupation. Fragmentary records suggest dwarven construction in its foundations, though elven influence appears in the later stonework. By the time Alzur and his associates took residence there, Rissberg had already gained a reputation among mages as a place where experiments that other institutions would not approve could be conducted away from oversight. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers officially disapproved of much of what happened at Rissberg, not openly, not with proclamations or sanctions, but quietly, in the way powerful institutions disapprove when something is too useful to forbid, but too unsettling to endorse. Alzur did not work alone. This detail is crucial. Later accounts, particularly those from regions that wanted to assign blame or glory to a single figure, would often simplify the narrative. Alzur, the creator of witchers. Alzur, the mad genius. Alzur, the visionary or the butcher, depending on who was telling the story. But Ortolan was explicit in his testimony. 3 names, not 1. Cosimo Malaspina was Alzur's master, the older mage whose expertise in genetic modification and hybridization laid the groundwork for what would follow. Accounts describe Malaspina as methodical, patient in his research, willing to spend decades on a single line of inquiry, where Alzur would later be remembered for the spells that bore his name. Alzur's thunder, Alzur's shield, Alzur's double cross. Malaspina's legacy was quieter, buried in technique rather than spectacle. Idarran of Ulivo was Alzur's apprentice, younger, more volatile in his interests. Where Malaspina studied hybridization with something approaching scientific detachment, Idarran seemed fascinated by mutation for its own sake, Creatures attributed to Idarran, various insectoid horrors collectively known as IDRS, would still be found centuries later in forests where humans rarely traveled. These three, along with several other mages whose names have not survived in the historical record with the same clarity, secured funding from local monarchs. The pitch was simple: enhanced humans capable of hunting and killing monsters that regular soldiers could not defeat. Mobile, sustainable monster hunters who could travel between kingdoms, taking contracts, eliminating threats, requiring no standing army's worth of resources to maintain. The kings agreed. They provided gold, supplies, and, most importantly, they provided subjects for the experiments. Acquiring children for the mutations was apparently not difficult. This is one of the more unsettling aspects preserved in the fragmentary accounts. One source, citing testimony from early Witcher survivors, mentions that Alzur would oftentimes kidnap or pay the parents of children to obtain subjects. The phrasing is clinical: kidnap or pay, as if these were equivalent methods of acquisition, both acceptable depending on circumstances. Other accounts suggest that orphans were taken, or children from families desperate enough to accept payment in exchange for offspring they could not afford to feed. Whether any of these children were volunteers in any meaningful sense is doubtful. The age range mentioned, young enough for bodies to be malleable, according to Cosimo Malaspina's theory, suggests subjects who could not have comprehended what they were agreeing to, assuming anyone bothered to ask. 38 children were gathered for the first trials at Rissberg. This number appears in records preserved by the mages themselves, though whether it represents the total across all early attempts or specifically the first major cohort is not entirely clear. Fragmentary records mention both girls and boys in this initial group, suggesting the early experimenters had not yet determined whether sex affected survival rates. They were brought to Rissberg Castle. They were housed. They were trained. Rudimentary sword work, survival skills, basic alchemy. The training served two purposes: to prepare them for their eventual role as monster hunters, and to strengthen their bodies for the mutations that would follow. The training itself proved fatal for at least 4 of the children before the actual mutagenic trials even began. One account mentions climbing exercises on the castle's exterior walls. Another describes obstacle courses designed to build reflexes, where failure meant injury or worse. The mages apparently viewed this attrition as acceptable. Better to lose subjects to training than to waste valuable alchemical components on bodies that would not survive the real transformation. The survivors, 34 children who made it through the initial preparation, then underwent the mutations themselves. The process involved alchemical concoctions, viral infections, hormonal treatments. The specifics have not survived in accessible records, or if they have survived, they remain locked away in places like Rissberg, where later generations of mages continue work the Brotherhood of Sorcerers would prefer not to acknowledge publicly. What is known? The mutations were agonizing. Accounts describe children screaming for days. Accounts describe bodies rejecting the process entirely, systems shutting down, subjects dying in convulsions or hemorrhages or slower degradation as organs failed one by one. Some transformations were worse than death. One fragmentary source mentions subjects who survived the physical changes but lost their minds entirely, becoming something neither human nor fully other, requiring termination as a mercy. Of the 34 children who underwent the trials, only 5 boys survived, a detail preserved in both game materials that expand on the lore and implied by the catastrophic failure rates referenced in book sources. 5. The mages had promised their royal benefactors an army of enhanced monster hunters. They had gathered children from across the region. They had spent months in preparation, enormous resources in rare alchemical components, countless hours of research and experimentation. And they produced 5 survivors, 5 boys whose bodies had accepted the mutations, whose minds remained intact enough to function, whose new physical capabilities made them genuinely superhuman. Faster reflexes, enhanced strength, eyes that could see in near darkness, senses sharp enough to track monsters through wilderness, resistance to toxins that would kill normal humans. But only 5. The royal backers looked at the survival rate and withdrew their funding. The mathematics were simple. If 3 out of every 4 children died in training before the mutations even began, and only 5 out of 34 survived the actual transformation, the cost per successful Witcher was absurd. Better to spend the gold on conventional soldiers, even if those soldiers were less effective against monsters. At least soldiers reproduced naturally and didn't require years of alchemical torture to become functional. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, watching from a distance, declared the experiment a failure. The mages at Rissberg were encouraged to pursue other lines of research. The 5 surviving boys were deemed interesting curiosities, but not the foundation of any sustainable program. Most of the mages accepted this assessment. They moved on to other projects. Alzur, Cosimo Malaspina, and Idarran of Ulivo did not. The 5 survivors were taken from Rissberg. Fragmentary accounts mention a castle called Morgrig, abandoned, situated in the Kestrel Mountains where human authority was thin and oversight unlikely. There, away from the Brotherhood's disapproval and the failed expectations of kings who had stopped caring, the 3 mages continued their work. They refined the mutations. They trained the survivors. They experimented on new subjects. Accounts differ on where these additional children came from, though the methods were presumably similar to those used at Rissberg: kidnapping, payment to desperate families, acquisition of orphans who would not be missed. The survival rate improved, not dramatically. The mutations remained brutal. The mortality rate remained high, but improved enough that within several years, Rissberg Castle housed not just 5 witchers, but dozens. They called themselves the Order of Witchers initially, or rather, the mages called them that, and the name stuck. The structure mimicked knightly orders that existed elsewhere in human kingdoms, a deliberate choice, perhaps, to give the project legitimacy it would not otherwise possess. These were not failed experiments hidden in mountain castles. These were knights, mutant knights, admittedly, but knights nonetheless. They were trained in combat. They were taught alchemy, how to brew potions that would enhance their already enhanced abilities, how to identify ingredients, how to prepare oils for their blades that would wound creatures resistant to normal weapons. They were educated in monster lore. What signs indicated specific creatures? What weaknesses could be exploited? What environments favored which threats? And they were taught signs, simple combat magic that even their limited magical ability could manifest. Ard, a telekinetic force. Igni, flame. Quen, protective shield. Erden, a trap. Axi, mental influence. Records suggest Cosimo Malaspina played a significant role in developing these simplified forms, though the attribution comes primarily from game materials expanding on book references. What the books establish clearly is that witchers possess these abilities. The question of precisely who designed them for witcher use involves inference from fragmentary sources. The signs were ingenious adaptations. True sorcerers looked down on them as crude, limited, barely worthy of being called magic at all. But for witchers, whose mutations had opened them to the flow of magic without granting them the full depth of power that real mages possessed, the signs were perfect, simple enough to learn, versatile enough to be useful, powerful enough to make the difference between surviving a hunt and dying to something that moved faster than a sword could swing. The order grew. The first generation of witchers completed their training and set out on what they called the path, traveling between settlements, taking contracts to eliminate monster threats, collecting payment, returning to Morgrig in winter to rest and train the next generation of recruits. They were effective. Fragmentary accounts from villages across the northern kingdoms mention witchers arriving, eliminating threats that had plagued entire regions, then disappearing before anyone could ask too many questions about what exactly these mutants were or where they had come from. The success should have validated Alzur's vision. The project he had continued despite the Brotherhood's disapproval, despite the withdrawal of royal funding, was working. Witchers were doing exactly what they had been designed to do. But Alzur, Cosimo Malaspina, and Idarran of Ulivo eventually departed the order. The reasons for their departure are not preserved with clarity. Some accounts suggest the 3 mages felt their work was complete. They had created a sustainable system, trained successors who could perform the mutations on new candidates, established the order as an institution that would continue without them. Other accounts hint at disagreements, either among the 3 mages themselves, or between the mages and the first generation of witchers who were beginning to question the authority of their creators. What is clear, the 3 left. They entrusted the secrets of witcher creation to other mages who remained at Morgrig, and then they went their separate ways. The Order of Witchers, left without its founders, eventually fragmented. The fragmentation happened slowly. Over years, rather than in a single catastrophic event, witchers began competing for contracts, accusing each other of claim jumping, threatening violence over territorial disputes that the order's structure had been meant to prevent. One incident in particular marked the beginning of the end. A witcher named Renegade attacked another named Rhys, nearly killing him over a perceived betrayal. When Renegade returned to Morgrey, he brought allies. A battle followed, witchers fighting witchers within the castle that had been built to train them. The order proved victorious in that specific battle, but the damage was done. Renegade and his followers left to establish their own school in the Amel Mountains, what would later be known as the School of the Bear. Others followed this example. Witchers split along philosophical lines, regional preferences, different approaches to the mutations and training that would define their respective traditions. The School of the Griffin, the School of the Cat, the School of the Viper, the School of the Manticore, the School of the Wolf, which would eventually establish itself at Kaer Morhen, the fortress where centuries later, a white-haired witcher named Geralt would be trained. Each school adapted the original mutations in different ways. Each developed its own culture, its own reputation. Some schools became known for honor and restraint. Others became associated with brutality, taking contracts that involved political assassination as readily as monster hunting. But all of them traced their lineage back to the same source, back to Rissberg Castle, to Morgrey, to the three mages who had decided that creating new kinds of humans was a problem worth solving. Back to Alzur. Alzur's legacy was not limited to witchers. The mage whose name became attached to the mutations was also remembered for his spells. Three in particular survived the centuries with attribution intact: Alzur's Thunder, Alzur's Shield, and Alzur's Double Cross. Alzur's Thunder was a combat spell, lightning or lightning-adjacent energy that could kill targets at range. Accounts describe it as powerful enough to drive off multiple attackers, though the specifics of its mechanism are not detailed in accessible sources. The spell remained in use by mages centuries after Alzur's death. In one documented case, the sorceress Tissaia of Rhys cast it during a battle, though whether she learned it from preserved texts or from oral transmission among mages is unclear. Alzur's Shield was defensive magic, protection against both physical and magical assault. Fragmentary records mention the sorceress Triss Merigold employing this spell to protect the witcher Geralt during a specific incident, suggesting the shield was robust enough to be worth casting even for someone as durable as a witcher. But it was Alzur's Double Cross that carried the most weight, the most danger, the most enduring infamy. Alzur's Double Cross was a summoning spell, not summoning in the sense of calling an existing creature from one location to another, but summoning in the sense of creation, forcing something into existence that had not existed before, pulling it from elsewhere or from nothing, depending on which theoretical framework one applied. The creatures summoned by the Double Cross were large. Fragmentary accounts mention sizes that made dragons look manageable. These were beings that could level cities, that could not be controlled once manifested, that existed only to destroy until they were themselves destroyed, or until they departed to regions where humans no longer needed to worry about them. The most infamous example, the Viy of Maribor. Fragmentary accounts describe a massive centipede-like creature, mutated beyond any natural insectoid form, appearing in the city of Maribor through use of the Double Cross. The creature destroyed approximately half the city before fleeing to the forest of Riverdale, where it entered a dormant state. According to accounts that may or may not be reliable, given their survival only in later retellings, the Viy killed Alzur himself in the process of its manifestation. Whether this death was an accident, Alzur losing control of what he had summoned, or an inevitable outcome of casting the spell is not specified. Other creatures may have been created using the Double Cross. A being called a koshchey, created by another mage named Fregenal, was possibly the result of this spell, though that attribution is uncertain. What is certain, Alzur created not just witchers, but monsters. The same mind that developed mutations to help humans survive against creatures from the Conjunction also developed spells to create new threats that humanity would need to survive. Whether this constitutes hypocrisy or merely thoroughness in exploring the possibilities of transformation remains a question without easy answer. The mutations worked because children screamed, not a metaphor, not dramatic exaggeration, The process of transforming human children into witchers required agony on a scale that broke some subjects before their bodies could finish changing. Accounts preserved from survivors, centuries later, in testimony given to those who cared to record such things, describe days of continuous pain, burning in the blood, vision fracturing into pieces that wouldn't resolve correctly, bones stretching, muscles tearing and rebuilding, organs adapting to process toxins that should have been lethal. One fragmentary account, attributed to a witcher of the early generations, though his name has not survived clearly in the records, describes the experience. Burning all over, inside and out, and all while strapped down to a laboratory table. The straps were necessary. Subjects who were not restrained would thrash violently enough to injure themselves, potentially to disrupt the transformation in ways that would prove fatal. Better to bind them. Better to ensure they survived the process, even if survival meant enduring helplessness, while their bodies were rewritten at a fundamental level. The mortality rate improved after the initial disaster at Rissberg, but improvement is relative. Even in later years, when the techniques had been refined and the mages performing the mutations had more experience, the survival rate remained brutally low. 3 out of 10 children survived if one was fortunate, sometimes fewer. Those who did not survive died in various ways. Some simply stopped breathing, their systems overwhelmed by the viral infections and alchemical components forced into their bodies. Others succumbed to hemorrhaging, internal bleeding that no amount of preparation could prevent entirely. Some died slowly, over days, as their organs failed one by one while the mutations tried and failed to take hold. And then there were the ones who survived the physical transformation but lost their minds. This outcome was apparently common enough to warrant specific protocols. When a subject completed the mutations but displayed signs of complete mental breakdown, unable to respond to commands, lost in hallucinations that would not recede, violent in ways that suggested no reasoning remained, they were terminated. The word used in fragmentary accounts is terminated, not killed. Clinical language. The same clinical detachment appears throughout the scattered records of the Witcher creation process. Subjects, not children. Termination, not murder. Failure rates, not death counts. The question of consent haunts the entire enterprise. Did any child volunteer to become a Witcher? The answer depends on how one defines volunteer, and how much weight one assigns to circumstances that left few real choices. Some children were kidnapped outright. Fragmentary accounts are clear on this point. Alzur and his associates, when they needed subjects, were willing to take children by force. Whether these kidnappings were opportunistic or planned, whether they targeted specific types of children or simply whoever could be acquired, the records do not specify. Other children were acquired through payment to their families. The amounts are not preserved with precision, but one can infer that families desperate enough to accept money in exchange for their offspring were likely not in positions to refuse. Poverty makes many decisions feel less like choices and more like inevitabilities dressed in the language of consent. Orphans were also taken. Children with no families to negotiate with, no one to protest their acquisition, no one who would search for them if they disappeared into castles in remote mountains. These children at least were not torn from parents' arms. Whether that constitutes a meaningful distinction is unclear. The age of subjects was apparently crucial. Cosimo Malaspina's theory, preserved in fragments, repeated in later texts, held that younger bodies were more malleable, more capable of accepting the mutations without rejecting them entirely. This theory proved accurate in practice. Attempts to create witchers from adults had failed spectacularly during earlier experiments at a location called Kaer, so they took children, young enough that their bodies would accept the transformation, young enough that they could be trained before the mutations, conditioned to accept their role as tools, rather than people with choices about how to live. Whether any of these children understood what they were agreeing to, assuming anyone bothered to explain, assuming any explanation would be honest rather than reassuring lies, is doubtful. How does one explain to a child that they will be strapped to a table and injected with substances that will kill most of their peers? How does one obtain meaningful consent for agony that cannot be adequately described in advance? The witchers themselves, in later centuries, would perpetuate this system, not because they enjoyed taking children, not because they celebrated the mortality rate or the pain, but because the law of surprise, an ancient custom that the witchers adapted for their own purposes, allowed them to acquire subjects without needing to kidnap or buy them. A man saves another's life and invokes the law of surprise. Give me what you find at home, but do not expect. If the man's wife is pregnant and he did not know, the child becomes the payment. If a child has been born while he was away, the child is the price. Destiny, the Witchers called it. A child of destiny, claimed by the law of surprise, was owed to the Witcher who invoked it. The Witchers treated these children better than Alzur's first generation, perhaps. They did not see them merely as experimental subjects. They trained them as apprentices, taught them the skills they would need to survive, gave them something resembling a purpose, even if that purpose was chosen for them before they were old enough to choose anything. But the fundamental transaction remained unchanged. Children, acquired through methods that gave them no meaningful say, transformed through processes that killed most of them, surviving into lives they had not chosen for work that would likely kill them before they reached old age. Alzur built this system, whether he built it with full awareness of its ethical implications, or whether he simply saw a problem, monsters killing humans, and solved it with the most efficient method available. The records do not clearly state. The mutations themselves achieved something remarkable. A Witcher's eyes could see in conditions where normal humans would be effectively blind. Not complete darkness, even Witchers needed some light. But twilight, moonlight, the dim ambiance of caves or forests at dusk became as navigable as midday to mutated vision. This adaptation alone made Witchers vastly more effective against monsters that preferred to hunt after dark. Their reflexes operated at speeds that seemed superhuman because they were superhuman. A Witcher could dodge attacks that would be invisible blurs to normal perception. They could strike faster than most creatures could react, could reposition in combat with fluidity that made trained knights look clumsy by comparison. Strength increased, though not to the absurd degrees that some later tales would claim. A Witcher was not going to lift a horse or shatter stone with bare hands, but they were significantly stronger than humans of equivalent size and training, enough to wield swords that would be unwieldy for others, enough to overpower creatures that might otherwise dominate through physical advantage. Toxin resistance was perhaps the most crucial enhancement. Witchers could consume potions that would kill normal humans in minutes. These potions enhanced their already enhanced abilities, speeding their reflexes further, sharpening their vision to predatory acuity, temporarily increasing strength or healing. The potions were still poisons. Witchers who consumed too many would suffer consequences, but their bodies could process these toxins fast enough that the benefits outweighed the damage, at least in the short term. Healing was accelerated. Injuries that might leave a normal human incapacitated for weeks would close in days for a Witcher. They did not regenerate severed limbs. They were not invulnerable, but their bodies repaired damage with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, and they lived longer. Not immortal, but long-lived enough that Witchers could see centuries pass if they avoided the many things that would kill them. Their aging slowed dramatically after the mutations completed their work. A Witcher might appear to be in their 30s for decades, showing little sign of the passage of time that would turn a normal human gray and frail. These enhancements were bought with the lives of children who did not survive the process. 3, 4, sometimes 5 children dead for everyone who lived. Hundreds of children dead across the decades of Witcher creation, across the multiple schools that continued the practice after the original order fragmented. The mathematics were simple. The ethics were not. What does one do with knowledge that creates monsters? Alzur answered this question in a peculiar way. He created both the hunters and the hunted. The Witchers were designed to kill monsters. The mutations gave them the tools they needed. The training gave them the knowledge. The law of surprise gave them a steady supply of new candidates to replace those who died on the path. The entire system was built around the premise that monsters were a problem requiring a solution. And then Alzur created new monsters. Alzur's double cross, the spell that would define part of his legacy as thoroughly as the Witchers themselves, was a tool for summoning or creating. The distinction is blurry in the accounts that survive. Massive creatures that serve no purpose except destruction. Why? The question feels almost naively simple. Why would someone who spent years developing methods to hunt monsters also develop methods to create them? But the records offer no clear answer. Motivations are not preserved. Alzur did not leave a manifesto explaining his reasoning. Later scholars, attempting to reconstruct the logic, offer various theories but no consensus. One interpretation, pure research. Alzur was a mage interested in the mechanics of life, transformation, creation. Witchers represented one application of that interest, modifying existing humans into more effective forms. Monsters represented another application, bringing into being creatures that did not exist before, testing the limits of what transformation could achieve. Both projects served the same fundamental curiosity about what was possible. Another interpretation, Alzur was creating problems that would justify continued investment in witchers. If the monsters from the conjunction eventually declined in numbers, if they were hunted to near extinction or adapted to avoid human settlements, then the need for witchers might diminish. But if new threats kept emerging, if creatures that had not existed before began appearing, then witchers would remain necessary indefinitely. This interpretation cast Alzur as cynical, deliberately perpetuating the problem his other work was meant to solve. A third interpretation, Alzur did not think in terms of problems and solutions at all. He was interested in transformation itself, in the act of creation, in demonstrating capability. Whether the things he created were helpful or harmful was secondary to the fact that he could create them. This interpretation makes Alzur less a visionary and more a craftsman obsessed with his craft to the exclusion of considering its consequences. None of these interpretations can be verified. Alzur did not explain himself in surviving records. What remains is the work. Witchers who saved villages from creatures that would have destroyed them, and creatures like the Viy that destroyed cities despite any attempt to stop them. The Viy of Maribor became legend, though the legends differ on details. Fragmentary accounts describe a creature of massive size, centipede-like in its basic form but mutated beyond anything that could be called natural. Multiple legs, dozens, perhaps hundreds, depending on the account. A body that could coil through city streets, crushing buildings simply by existing in proximity to them. Intelligence of uncertain scope, enough at least to flee after its rampage rather than fight until destroyed. Whether the Viy was summoned intentionally or emerged as an accident of the double cross being cast incorrectly, the accounts do not agree. Some versions suggest Alzur was attempting to summon a creature to end a war, the War of Daggers, a conflict between rival claimants to power that had dragged on for over a century. Alzur supposedly used his spell to create something that would be so devastating that both sides would be forced to surrender rather than continue fighting. If this was the intent, it worked in the narrow sense that one side did surrender, but the creature did not disappear after serving its purpose. It destroyed half of Maribor before departing. The death toll was never accurately recorded. Such records are difficult to maintain when the structures that would house them have been reduced to rubble, and the scribes who would write them are dead or fled. Some accounts claim Alzur died in the summoning, killed by the creature he had brought into being. Whether this death was immediate, the Viy turning on its summoner in the first moments of its existence, or whether Alzur survived long enough to witness what his spell had done before the creature killed him, the stories vary. Other accounts suggest Alzur survived the Viy and died later, perhaps of old age, perhaps in some other magical misadventure. The uncertainty itself is telling. For a mage whose name became attached to multiple schools of witchers, to spells still used centuries later, to creatures that terrorized entire cities, the details of his death are unclear. He created systems that outlived him. Whether he witnessed the full consequences of those systems is unknowable. After destroying Maribor, the Viy fled to the forests of Riverdale. There it entered a state that accounts describe as dormant, sleeping, hibernated. Centuries later, the Council of Sorcerers, curious about what remained of Alzur's creation, sent envoys to study the creature. The envoys died. The Viy, disturbed from its slumber, killed them before disappearing again. Some reports suggest it headed south, toward Doldu Loka. Others claim it vanished entirely, passing into one of the many monster lairs scattered across regions too dangerous for regular human habitation. Whether the Viy still exists somewhere, dormant or active, is unknown. If it does, it represents a direct line back to Alzur's work, a creature that should not exist, created through magic that transformed possibility into flesh and hunger. Other creatures attributed to Alzur's methods or his disciples are scattered across the continent. The koshchey, a massive arthropod, neither crab nor spider but possessing features of both, armored to the point that even witchers struggled to penetrate its carapace, appears in Sapkowski's writing, specifically in a short story titled A Road with No Return, which has not received official English translation. Whether it was created using Alzur's double cross, or a related technique called the triangle within a triangle, is suggested by later materials but not definitively stated in the original text. What the story establishes is that such a creature existed, that it required extraordinary effort to kill, and that its creation involved magical practices related to the transformation techniques Alzur pioneered. The first koshchey's creation is attributed in some sources to a mage named Fregonal, identified as an ex-druid, though these attributions appear more commonly in game materials and wikis synthesizing multiple sources than in Sapkowski's direct text. What can be stated with confidence is that someone created at least one koshchey, that the sorceress Vicenna, Geralt's mother, destroyed it using a spell called the Mirror Effect, and that the effort required suggests the creature represented a significant magical achievement and threat. Years later, another koshchey appeared, suggesting either multiple creations or incomplete destruction of the first, though the details remain murky in surviving accounts. Idarran of Ulivo, Alzur's apprentice, created creatures called IDRS, insectoid monsters of various configurations, all mutated beyond natural forms. These creatures appear in Season of Storms, where Geralt encounters mutants associated with Rissberg's experimental work. An account from what would be the 14th century mentions a white-haired witcher, almost certainly Geralt based on the Oz timeline and description, killing one of the last Idars in Magpie Forest in Temeria. The phrasing, one of the last, suggests the species had declined to near extinction, though whether from active hunting or natural die-off is not specified. That they survived approximately 4 centuries after their creation indicates they either reproduced or persisted individually far longer than most creatures their size normally would. Whether Alzur directly participated in creating Idars or whether Idarran developed them independently using techniques learned from his master, the sources do not specify. What is clear, the knowledge of how to create monsters spread beyond Alzur himself. His techniques were taught, replicated, varied. Other mages learned to bring things into being that would outlive everyone involved in their creation. The ethical weight of this work was apparently not a primary consideration. Or rather, if the mages involved experienced doubts about transforming children into monster hunters, or creating new monsters for those hunters to fight, they did not record those doubts in accessible places. What remains in the fragments are methodologies, outcomes, procedures. The inner lives of the creators are absent. Ortolan, speaking to Geralt centuries later, defended the work. You should hold them in esteem. Alzur, his successors, and their works. The defense is revealing in what it assumes. The Witchers exist. They hunt monsters. Therefore, the work that created them was justified. The mathematics of survival, thousands of people saved by Witchers across the centuries, versus hundreds of children who died becoming Witchers, apparently resolve clearly in favor of creation. But mathematics does not address whether consent matters, whether the children who died screaming had any right to refuse what was done to them, whether creating monsters to justify the creation of monster hunters constitutes ethical coherence, or something closer to malign cynicism. The Witchers themselves had complicated relationships with their origins. Some, like Geralt of Rivia, accepted what they were while maintaining distance from the institution that created them. Others sought revenge against the mages who had transformed them, seeing their mutations as violations rather than gifts. One account preserved in game materials describes a Witcher confronting a woman named Galanthea, who had known Alzur personally. Do you even have an inkling of how Alzur and his lackeys make Witchers? They take little boys, nab them from the streets, pay off parents if they have to, do whatever they can to get their hands on fresh subjects. They were worse, much worse. But, as you see, I survived. The only one to live out of all those chosen for further trials. You say he does it all for some vision of a better world. I say fuck that. He does it all for himself. This testimony, assuming it accurately represents the perspective of early Witchers, suggests that at least some of those who survived saw Alzur not as a benefactor, but as someone who used them. The distinction between being created for a purpose and being exploited for someone else's ambition can be difficult to navigate when the purpose and the ambition are so thoroughly intertwined. The legacy persisted because it worked. Witchers hunted monsters, they saved villages, they killed creatures that would have otherwise killed dozens or hundreds of people. The mutations that transformed them, brutal as they were, proved effective at creating humans capable of surviving encounters that would be death sentences for anyone else. The schools that emerged after the order fragmented continued the practice. The School of the Wolf at Kaer Morhen, the School of the Griffin at Kaer after the curses there were broken, the School of the Cat, School of the Viper, School of the Manticore, School of the Bear. All of them took children, subjected them to mutations with mortality rates that remained horrifically high, produced new generations of witchers who would go out onto the path and repeat the cycle. Some schools were more selective. Some tried to improve the survival rates. Some treated their trainees with something approaching compassion rather than viewing them merely as material to be processed. But all of them participated in the same fundamental system: children transformed into tools, with death as the most common outcome. By the time Geralt of Rivia was trained at Kaer Morhen, centuries after Alzur's death, generations removed from the founding of the Order, the practice had become routine. The Witchers knew their origins. They knew the cost. They knew that most of the children who underwent the trials would die. And they continued because the alternative was allowing the knowledge to disappear, allowing Witchers to die out entirely, leaving humans vulnerable to monsters that regular soldiers could not effectively fight. Whether this justification holds ethical weight, or merely rationalizes continuation of a system that grinds children into ash in exchange for superhuman monster hunters, remains a question without consensus. Alzur built the system. His successors maintained it. The children paid the price. Spells do not die with their creators. This is one of the fundamental truths of magic in the world the conjunction created. A mage might perish from age, from violence, from the consequences of their own experiments, but the formulas they developed, the structures of will and chaos they learned to shape, these could be passed down, written in grimoires, taught to apprentices, preserved in the collective knowledge of institutions like the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. Alzur created at least 3 spells significant enough to bear his name centuries after his death. That alone marks him as exceptional. Most mages, even powerful ones, leave no lasting impression on magical practice. Their personal techniques die with them or are forgotten within a generation. To have multiple spells carry forward through the centuries, known by name, still used by sorceresses and sorcerers who never met their creator, that suggests work of unusual quality or unusual impact. Alzur's Thunder, Alzur's Shield, Alzur's Double Cross. 3 spells, 3 different approaches to the problems magic could solve. 3 legacies that spread far beyond the mountain castles where witchers were made. Alzur's Thunder was, at its foundation, a combat spell designed to kill. The mechanics are not preserved with perfect clarity in accessible sources. What remains are descriptions of effects, electrical or electrical adjacent energy, manifested with enough force to incapacitate or destroy targets at range. Accounts mention its use against groups of attackers, suggesting the spell could affect multiple targets, or it could be directed rapidly between them. The spell's reputation survived because it proved useful. Mages centuries after Alzur's death still learned it, still cast it when situations demanded offensive magic with immediate lethal effect. This suggests the spell was not merely powerful, but also relatively reliable, a combination rare enough in magic that spells meeting both criteria tend to propagate through magical communities, even when their creators are otherwise forgotten. The spell appears in various accounts of magical combat. The Netflix adaptation of The Witcher depicts the sorceress Tissaia de Vries casting Alzur's Thunder during the coup at Thanedd Island, an event that Sapkowski's books describe in detail but without specifying this particular spell. The show's choice to feature thunder suggests the production team recognized it as suitably dramatic and historically appropriate for a skilled mage defending against catastrophic assault. Whether the book's Tissaia used this specific spell or other offensive magic, the pattern remains clear. Alzur's Thunder remained part of the combat repertoire centuries after its creation. The spell's name alone, Thunder, suggests something about its nature. Thunder is sound caused by lightning. Whether Alzur's spell actually produced lightning or produced something that resembled lightning closely enough that observers called it thunder, the association stuck. Electrical energy as a weapon had advantages, difficult to block without specific countermeasures, fast enough that dodging was challenging, capable of jumping between targets if conditions allowed. Whether Alzur developed the spell before or after creating Witchers, the records do not specify. One could construct narratives either way. Thunder as an early work, demonstrating Alzur's capability with combat magic before he turned his attention to biological transformation. or thunder as a later development, created after witchers were established, perhaps as a tool for hunting creatures that proved resistant to conventional magical attacks. The truth is unknowable from surviving sources. What remains is the spell itself, passed down through generations of mages who never met Alzur but learned his technique nonetheless. Alzur's shield represented a different magical priority: protection rather than destruction. Defensive magic is often undervalued in accounts that focus on dramatic conflicts. A shield that prevents harm does not generate the same narrative interest as a spell that reduces enemies to ash, but from a practical standpoint, protection is frequently more valuable than offense. A mage who cannot be harmed has time to cast other spells, time to retreat, time to outlast opponents who exhaust themselves, trying to penetrate defenses that do not break. Alzur's shield was apparently robust enough to be worth casting even when protecting targets who were already durable. Accounts from later Witcher adventures mention the sorceress Triss Merigold, employing magical shields to protect Geralt during dangerous encounters. Whether these were specifically Alzur's shield or other defensive magic is not always specified in the sources, but the pattern suggests protective spells bearing Alzur's name remained part of the repertoire sorceresses learned and used. The fact that Triss considered the shield necessary for someone as physically resilient as a Witcher suggests the threat they faced was substantial. Witchers could survive injuries that would kill normal humans. Their enhanced healing, their toxin resistance, their reinforced skeletal structure, all of these made them difficult to damage through conventional means. If Alzur's shield provided protection beyond what a Witcher's mutations already granted, the spell must have been capable of deflecting or absorbing significant force. The mechanics, again, are not preserved with precision. Magical shields in general function by creating barriers, either physical manifestations of solidified chaos, or fields that redirect incoming energy away from the protected target. Whether Alzur's shield operated through one of these mechanisms or employed some other approach, the sources do not detail. What can be inferred? The spell was effective enough to remain in use centuries after its creation. Triss Merigold was a skilled sorceress, trained at Aretuza, experienced in both courtly politics and practical magical application. She would not have bothered learning a defensive spell that was obsolete or inferior to more modern alternatives. If she knew Alzur's shield, if she cast it when she needed to protect Geralt, it suggests the spell remained competitive with contemporary protective magic. The duration of the shield's effect is not specified in accessible accounts. Some magical protections last only moments, long enough to deflect a single attack before dissipating. Others can be maintained for extended periods, providing ongoing defense as long as the caster maintains concentration and has sufficient energy to sustain the spell. Whether Alzur's shield fell into one category or the other, or operated through some intermediate mechanism, the records do not make clear. What is clear, centuries after Alzur died, mages still found his protective magic worth using. That alone marks the spell as a significant contribution to magical practice. But it was Alzur's double cross that defined the darker aspect of his legacy. A spell designed specifically to create or summon massive creatures. A spell that, according to every account that mentions it, produced beings too large, too dangerous, too uncontrollable to serve any purpose except devastation. The name itself invites interpretation. Double cross suggests betrayal, deception, something turning against its creator or user. Whether this was intentional wordplay on Alzur's part, acknowledging that creatures summoned by this spell would inevitably betray whoever brought them into being, or whether the name emerged later, applied by scholars who saw the pattern of destruction, is unclear. What is documented? Multiple creatures attributed to the double cross share certain characteristics: size far beyond natural limits, aggressive behavior that made control impossible, resistance to conventional means of termination, a tendency to cause catastrophic damage before being destroyed or driven away. The Viy of Maribor, already discussed, represents the most infamous example: a centipede mutated to city-destroying scale, summoned or created through Alzur's spell, responsible for leveling approximately half of a major urban center before fleeing to forest regions where human authority was thin. The koshchey created by Fregonal, assuming it was indeed created using the double cross or a related technique, demonstrated similar characteristics. Massive arthropod form, armored to the point that penetrating its carapace required specific knowledge and specialized weaponry, aggressive enough that it killed extensively before being stopped. Whether the creatures summoned by the double cross possessed intelligence is debated in what little scholarly analysis of the spell survives. Some accounts suggest the beings were mindless, driven only by base instincts to feed and destroy. Other accounts attribute rudimentary intelligence, enough to flee when threatened, enough to select targets, enough to adapt tactics when initial approaches proved ineffective. The truth likely varies by specimen. Creatures brought into being through magical transformation might not have standardized mental capabilities. Each summoning might produce something slightly different, depending on variables in the casting or in the chaos manipulated to create the form. What unified them all? They were catastrophes. Every documented use of Alzur's double cross resulted in significant death and destruction. Whether this was an inevitable property of the spell itself, something in the magical formula that ensured the creatures could not be controlled, or whether mages using the spell simply lacked the skill or knowledge to manage what they created, the pattern was consistent. Alzur created a spell that made monsters, not minor threats, not creatures that could be hunted by normal means. Monsters that required intervention from powerful mages, that sometimes could not be destroyed, and had to be driven away instead. That left scars on the landscape and the collective memory of regions where they appeared. And this spell, like thunder and shield, propagated. Other mages learned it, or learned enough of it to attempt their own variations. Fregonal, the ex-druid who created the koshchey, clearly had access to knowledge of how the double cross worked, whether he learned it directly from Alzur's writings or reconstructed it from fragmentary information. The spell's propagation suggests something troubling about magical culture. A technique that consistently produced uncontrollable threats might have been expected to die out, suppressed by the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, or simply abandoned by mages who recognized the danger. Instead, it persisted. Mages centuries after Alzur's death still knew of the double cross, still attempted to use it, still created creatures that then needed to be stopped at great cost. Why? The question has no single answer preserved in accessible sources, but examining the patterns of how magical knowledge typically spreads within the Brotherhood's networks, several possibilities emerge. First possibility: academic curiosity drove preservation. Mages studying transformation and the limits of creation would naturally view the double cross as crucial data. The spell represented an extreme case of what magic could achieve. Understanding its mechanics might advance the field, even if practical applications proved too dangerous. A logic familiar from other branches of magical research, where knowledge is valued independent of its utility. Second possibility: the spell offered strategic deterrence. A mage capable of summoning city-destroying creatures possessed leverage in political negotiations. The creature's uncontrollability might matter less than its initial direction toward obstacles requiring removal. From this perspective, collateral damage becomes an acceptable cost measured against primary objectives achieved, a calculus not unknown in warfare, magical or otherwise. Third possibility: later mages worked from incomplete information. Alzur might have designed the double cross for specific conditions under specific constraints. Without full understanding of those limitations, subsequent attempts to replicate the spell could have produced catastrophic results by accident rather than design. This interpretation suggests the danger emerged not from the spell's intended function, but from its misapplication by those who learned it incompletely. None of these explanations fully accounts for why the spell remained known, why mages continued attempting to use it despite the documented outcomes. But between them, they suggest frameworks for understanding how magical knowledge propagates, even when that knowledge is demonstrably hazardous. The censored tome survived. This detail is important. At some point after Alzur's death, someone compiled his techniques, or portions of them, into a written work. This tome described methods for creating monsters. It included, according to later accounts, the double cross itself, along with information about creatures like the koshchey and the frightener. The tome was incomplete when it reached the hands of later scholars. Some pages had been torn out, either deliberately by someone who wanted to prevent certain knowledge from spreading, or accidentally through the degradation that affects old documents. What remained was enough to be dangerous. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers prepared a censored edition. This version provided information about the creatures, what they were, how to recognize them, potentially how to fight them, without including the actual formulas for creating them. The reasoning was presumably protective. Mages needed to know what these creatures were if they encountered them, but did not need the ability to make new ones. The preface to this censored edition, preserved in fragmentary form, includes a warning. To ensure safety, I would nevertheless suggest that readers never utter any formulae out loud and speak all vowels while inhaling. The specificity of this instruction is revealing. Speaking formulas aloud was apparently part of how certain spells were cast, modifying the vocalization, speaking vowels while inhaling, which would distort them significantly, might prevent accidental activation while still allowing the reader to understand the structure of the spell from the written form. This suggests the formulas in the tome were dangerous, even in written form, potentially castable by anyone with magical ability who read them correctly. The censored edition was attempting to navigate a narrow space, providing knowledge about Alzur's creations without providing the means to replicate them. Whether this censorship was effective is unclear. The fact that creatures attributable to the Double Cross continued appearing centuries after Alzur's death suggests either the censorship was incomplete, copies of the uncensored tome survived in private collections or hidden archives, or mages managed to reconstruct the spell from the censored version plus other fragmentary sources. The existence of the tome, censored or otherwise, demonstrates that Alzur's knowledge was considered valuable enough to preserve in written form. Someone went to the effort of compiling his techniques. Someone else went to the effort of editing them for broader distribution. The spell that created the Viy of Maribor, that destroyed half a city, was deemed important enough that information about it needed to be accessible to future generations of mages. This decision, to preserve rather than destroy, to disseminate rather than bury, reflects priorities about magical knowledge that are not necessarily obvious from a modern perspective. The catastrophic potential of the Double Cross did not outweigh the value of understanding how it worked. The danger was acknowledged through censorship, but the knowledge itself was protected. Alzur's spells, taken collectively, reveal a mind interested in extremes. Thunder, offensive magic pushed to lethal efficiency. Shield, defensive magic robust enough to protect even those already difficult to harm. Double Cross, creative magic scaled to produce creatures beyond natural limits. Each spell represented not just capability, but capability pushed toward maximum impact. Alzur did not apparently develop subtle magic. He developed magic that could not be ignored, that forced reactions, that altered situations through overwhelming force or protection or creation. This approach was mirrored in his work on Witchers. The mutations he helped develop did not create humans who were slightly better at fighting monsters. They created humans who were fundamentally different, stronger, faster, more durable, more toxic, longer lived. The transformation was total, not incremental. Whether this preference for extremes reflected Alzur's personality or simply reflected practical necessities, half measures would not solve the problems he was addressing. The sources do not clarify. What remains is the pattern. Everything Alzur created that survived in historical memory was defined by its intensity. This intensity made his work memorable. It also made his work dangerous. A mage who develops subtle techniques might be forgotten within a generation. A mage who develops techniques that reshape how magic is practiced, or that create threats requiring active management, centuries after his death, that mage becomes impossible to forget, even if what is remembered is uncomfortable. The propagation of Alzur's techniques through magical education is documented incompletely. Aretuza, the Academy for Sorceresses on Thanedd Island, almost certainly taught defensive magic that included or referenced Alzur's shield. Triss Merigold was trained at Aretuza. If she knew the spell, she learned it either there or from mentors associated with that institution. Whether Aretuza taught thunder is less clear. Combat magic was part of sorceress education, but the specific spells included in that curriculum varied over time and between instructors. Tisaya de Vries, as rector of Aretuza, would have had significant influence over what was taught. Her use of thunder suggests she considered it valuable, but whether she included it in standard instruction or learned it separately is not documented. Ban Ard, the Academy for Sorcerers, presumably had its own curriculum that might have included Alzur's techniques. The relationship between Ban Ard and institutions like Rissberg is not fully mapped in accessible sources. Rissberg, where Alzur conducted his Witcher experiments, was associated with the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, but operated with significant autonomy. Whether Ban Ard students learned from Rissberg mages or vice versa, whether there was systematic knowledge exchange or merely occasional contact, The details are fragmentary. What is clear? Alzur's spells spread beyond the immediate circle of mages who worked with him directly. They became part of the broader magical tradition, learned by sorceresses and sorcerers across multiple generations. This propagation happened despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that at least one of those spells, the Double Cross, was demonstrably too dangerous for casual use. The mechanisms of magical education tend to favor preservation of techniques that work, regardless of their ethical implications. A spell that achieves its intended effect reliably will be taught. Whether it should be taught, whether the knowledge of how to cast it should be restricted or eliminated entirely, these are separate questions that magical institutions have historically struggled to address consistently. Alzur benefited from this tendency. His work survived because it was effective. The fact that some of that work created problems as severe as the ones it solved did not prevent its propagation through the networks of magical knowledge that connected mages across the continent. 3 centuries after Alzur's death, give or take decades depending on which fragmentary chronology one accepts, a white-haired witcher stood in Rissberg Castle and was told he should be grateful. Ortolan, the ancient mage whose body had been trapped in senility by the very elixir that prevented his death, spoke to Geralt of Rivia about creation, about Cosimo Malaspina, about Idarran of Ulivo, about Alzur. They invented the mutation owing to which men like you were bred, owing to which you exist, owing to which you walk upon this earth, ungrateful one. You ought to esteem Alzur, his successors, and their works, and not destroy them. Geralt had come to Rissberg hunting a monster that had been killing villagers. What he found instead was history, the place where witchers were first made, still occupied by mages who continued work that most of the world had forgotten or never knew existed. Ortolan's rebuke was meant to defend that work, to remind Geralt that his existence was owed to the mages who had transformed children into hunters centuries before. Whether Geralt accepted this defense, whether he considered his existence a debt requiring gratitude, the immediate context does not fully resolve, but the exchange crystallizes a question that haunts Alzur's entire legacy. Should the witchers thank their creator, or should they curse him? The mathematics depend on what one chooses to measure. Witchers saved lives. This is documented extensively across centuries of their operation. Villages that would have been destroyed by monsters survived because a witcher took a contract and eliminated the threat. Travelers who would have died on roads infested with drowners or neckers reached their destinations because witchers cleared those roads. Nobles whose children would have been killed by cursed creatures paid witchers to break those curses and returned the victims to human form. Quantifying this impact precisely is impossible. How many lives saved? How many communities protected? How many threats eliminated that would have spread if left unchecked? The numbers cannot be calculated with confidence, but the pattern is clear. Witchers, as a class, performed a function that saved more human lives than would have been saved without them. Against this must be balanced the cost of creating those witchers. Hundreds of children dead across the centuries of witcher creation, different schools, different locations, all following variations of the same basic process. Take children, subject them to mutations that will kill most of them, train the survivors to hunt monsters. The exact death toll cannot be reconstructed from available sources. Records of early experiments were not preserved comprehensively. Later schools may have kept tallies of their candidates and survival rates, but those records, if they existed, are not accessible. What can be stated? For every witcher who survived to hunt monsters, multiple children died in the attempt to create that witcher. 3 dead for every survivor, according to some estimates, 4 or 5 in less favorable conditions. More during the experimental phases when techniques were still being developed. So the mathematics become thousands of human lives saved by witchers, purchased with hundreds of children's lives consumed in creating those witchers. Does this calculate to acceptable exchange? The question resists simple resolution, but examining it through different ethical frameworks reveals the tension. From a utilitarian perspective, measuring outcomes by aggregate welfare, the mathematics might favor creation. Thousands saved outweigh hundreds lost, assuming lives can be weighed so simply. The suffering of children who died in mutations, while tragic, becomes justifiable when measured against suffering prevented by witchers eliminating threats that would have consumed entire communities. This framework prioritizes consequences over means. From a deontological perspective, one that emphasizes inviolable principles, the calculation fails at its foundation. Using children as experimental subjects without meaningful consent violates core duties that cannot be overridden by beneficial outcomes. The ends, however desirable, cannot legitimize means that treat unwilling subjects as mere instruments. This framework insists that certain acts remain wrong regardless of their results. From a virtue ethical perspective, focusing on character and disposition, one might examine whether the willingness to kidnap children, subject them to fatal trials, and rationalize this as necessary reflects virtues worth cultivating or vices that corrupt practitioners. Does creating witchers require becoming the kind of person who can sacrifice the vulnerable for the greater good? And if so, what does that transformation cost the transformer? This framework treats the moral question as inseparable from questions about what kind of people we become through our choices. None of these frameworks resolves the question definitively. The mathematics of lives saved versus lives spent does not yield a single clear answer. What one concludes about Alzur's legacy depends significantly on which ethical framework one applies and how much weight one assigns to consent, suffering, and aggregate outcomes. The Witchers themselves held varied perspectives, though reconstructing these viewpoints centuries later involves piecing together scattered evidence. From Geralt's actions throughout Sapkowski's books, one can infer a kind of pragmatic acceptance. He did not campaign against the system that created him. He took contracts, killed monsters, moved on. His relationship with Vesemir, the older Witcher who trained him at Kaer Morhen, suggested respect rather than resentment, though Geralt's interior thoughts on his origins are never fully articulated in simple terms. He existed as a Witcher, and performed that function without apparent need to constantly justify or condemn the process that made him. Materials from CD Projekt Red's games, particularly the Gwent card game, which includes narrative expansions, present more explicitly bitter perspectives. One such account depicts a Witcher confronting someone who knew Alzur, expressing rage at the process. "We were just a means to an end for that bastard, a way to establish his reputation." This testimony, while dramatic and emotionally resonant, represents game-expanded characterization rather than direct book canon. It offers one possible Witcher perspective, viewing creators as exploiters rather than benefactors, but should be understood as interpretive expansion of the lore rather than Sapkowski's direct text. Between these poles, whether from book or game sources, lay what was likely a spectrum of positions, Witchers who acknowledged both the value of their capabilities and the cost of acquiring them. Witchers who would not thank Alzur but also would not waste energy hating someone dead for centuries. Witchers who simply did not think much about their origins, focused instead on survival in a world that feared them almost as much as it needed them. The diversity of responses suggests there was no single correct Witcher perspective on Alzur. Each Witcher had to navigate the question individually. What does it mean to exist because someone decided to transform you, knowing that transformation would kill most of your peers? The broader impact on the continent is difficult to assess with precision, but clearly substantial. Witchers became a recognized class within several generations of their creation. By the time Geralt was active, approximately 1200 Februaries through 1270s, Witchers were known across human kingdoms. Common people recognized the signs, medallions worn openly, distinctive eyes that marked the mutations, 2 swords carried rather than one. This recognition was not uniformly positive. Witchers were often feared, sometimes hated, occasionally attacked by mobs who saw them as abominations rather than protectors. The mutations that made them effective monster hunters also made them visibly inhuman. Yellow eyes, pallid skin, voices that carried a particular timbre. These markers set Witchers apart from normal humans in ways that triggered suspicion and hostility. But they were also needed. Villages that would celebrate a Witcher's arrival when monsters were threatening would turn hostile once the job was done and payment was extracted. This pattern, need when convenient, rejection when safe, defined much of the Witcher experience. They existed in a liminal space, human enough to interact with human societies, but other enough that full acceptance was impossible. The economic impact was modest, but real. Witchers charged for their services. The amounts varied. A poor village might offer a few coppers and a meal. A wealthy nobleman might pay hundreds of crowns for eliminating a significant threat. The total wealth flowing to witchers across the continent probably did not represent a major economic force. They were too few, too dispersed, too focused on survival rather than accumulation. But locally, the presence or absence of a witcher could determine whether a settlement prospered or was abandoned. A town near a forest infested with leshens might be uninhabitable until a witcher cleared the threat. A trade route plagued by griffins might be unusable until those creatures were eliminated. In these specific contexts, witchers represented the difference between economic viability and collapse. The cultural impact was more significant than the economic. Witchers appeared in songs, stories, superstitions. Some tales painted them as heroes, lone warriors standing between humanity and the darkness. Other tales cast them as monsters themselves, mutants who should be killed rather than tolerated. Dandelion, the bard who traveled with Geralt and chronicled his adventures, often with significant embellishment, contributed substantially to the cultural perception of witchers in the latter part of the 13th century. His songs shaped how people thought about witchers generally, and Geralt specifically. Whether this impact was ultimately beneficial or detrimental to witchers as a class is debatable. More fame meant more recognition, but also more expectations. More attention from forces that might otherwise have ignored mutant hunters operating on the margins of human society. By Geralt's time, witchers were declining. No new schools were being founded. The existing schools trained fewer candidates, though whether from lack of children to recruit, loss of knowledge about the mutations, or deliberate decisions to limit further creation varies by school and by account. Some schools had been destroyed entirely. Kaer itself suffered an attack by a peasant mob centuries before Geralt's birth, many witchers killed. Portions of the library containing mutation knowledge burned or stolen. The details of this attack survive primarily through oral transmission among the remaining Wolf School witchers, which makes precise reconstruction difficult, but leaves the basic fact undisputed. Kaer was sacked, and witcher creation knowledge was partially lost as a consequence. Whether this decline represented the natural end of an institution that had served its purpose, or the tragedy of losing capability that humanity still needed, depends again on perspective. Monsters were less numerous by the 13th century than they had been in the generations immediately after the conjunction. Witchers had been hunting them for 3 centuries. The most dangerous threats had been eliminated or driven to regions too remote to threaten human settlements regularly. Perhaps witchers were becoming obsolete, their role finished. Or perhaps the decline of witchers meant humanity was losing the capacity to deal with threats that still existed, just less visibly. Vampires, higher vampires especially, were still present. Leshens still haunted old forests. Griffins still nested in mountains. The fact that these creatures were rarer didn't mean they were gone. A world with fewer witchers might be a world more vulnerable to the threats that remained. Either way, Alzur's creation was ending. The schools were dying. The knowledge of how to create new witchers was being lost, or deliberately not transmitted. Within a few more generations, there might be no witchers at all. Whether that would constitute success, the problem solved, the institution no longer necessary, or failure, the solution abandoned before the problem was fully resolved, remained to be seen. The monsters Alzur created had their own trajectories. The Viy, if it still existed, had not been definitively located in centuries. Accounts placed it in various locations. Doldu Loka, other monster lairs scattered across regions humans avoided. Whether it was alive in some dormant state or had died sometime after destroying Maribor and killing the council's envoys who tried to study it, no one knew with certainty. Idarrans, the insectoid creatures associated with Idarran of Ulivo, were apparently rare by the 14th century. The last IDR killed in Magpie Forest might not have been literally the last, but the fact that an account described it that way suggests the species was in decline. Whether they were being actively hunted to extinction or simply dying out naturally, their population was clearly much reduced from earlier centuries. Other creatures possibly attributable to Alzur or his disciples, various mutated beasts that appeared in regions near Rissberg or other centers of experimental magic, had become rare enough that they no longer represented systematic threats to human populations. Individual specimens might still exist, might still kill occasionally, but they were anomalies rather than plagues. This pattern suggests that monsters created through magic, unlike monsters that arrived through the conjunction, did not establish sustainable populations. They were too large, too destructive, too energy intensive to reproduce successfully in an environment where humans were actively trying to eliminate them. Without mages continuing to create new examples, the population declined towards zero. In a perverse way, this made Alzur's monster-creating work more acceptable than it might have been. The Viy destroyed half a city, but there was only one Viy. It could be avoided or killed eventually. It did not spawn additional generations of city-destroying centipedes. The damage was catastrophic, but limited in scope. Compare this to monsters from the Conjunction. Drowners reproduced naturally. Neckers bred in tunnels and emerged in swarms. Ghouls appeared wherever humans left corpses. These creatures established ecological niches, however disturbed, and persisted across generations. They required ongoing management, ongoing hunting, ongoing Witcher intervention. Alzur's magically created monsters required one-time solutions. Once the Viy was gone, it was gone. Once the IDRs died out, they were finished. The immediate damage might be severe, but the long-term threat was self-limiting. Whether Alzur understood this distinction when he created the Double Cross, whether he intended his monsters to be temporary catastrophes rather than permanent plagues, cannot be determined from available sources. But the outcome was that his monsters, however destructive in the moment, did not become permanent features of the continent's threat landscape the way Conjunction creatures did. 3 centuries after his death, Alzur's name was still spoken. Not commonly. Not in the way truly famous mages like Geoffroy Monk or Hen Gedemdeath were remembered in scholarly circles, their work still studied, their contributions to magical theory still debated. Alzur was more specialized, his legacy more disturbing, his techniques less suitable for general instruction, but among Witchers, his name was known. Among mages who studied transformation or creation, his work was referenced. Among historians documenting the period after the Conjunction, his contributions could not be ignored. This kind of remembrance, specific rather than general, known by specialists rather than the broader population, might actually be more significant than widespread fame. Famous mages became legends, their actual work distorted by centuries of retelling, until the historical figure became difficult to separate from the myth. Alzur, remembered primarily by those who had direct reason to study his techniques, remained relatively unadorned by legend. What was remembered about him was his work, witchers, spells, monsters. The ethical assessment of that work remains unresolved, because the work itself remains active. Witchers still hunted in the 13th century. Alzur's spells were still being cast. His monsters, while declining, had not entirely disappeared. The consequences of his decisions continued manifesting centuries after he could no longer influence or control them. This is perhaps the defining characteristic of creation at Alzur's scale. He built systems that outlived him, that operated independently of his continued existence, that shaped the world for generations who never knew him personally. Whether those systems were beneficial or harmful, whether they should have been built at all, these questions persist because the systems themselves persist. In the end, Alzur cannot be easily categorized. He was not simply a hero who saved humanity from monsters. The methods he employed, kidnapping or purchasing children, subjecting them to mutations that killed most of them, creating new monsters alongside the hunters meant to fight them, sit uncomfortably with heroic narratives. He was not simply a villain who tortured children for personal glory. The witchers he created did save lives. The techniques he developed did provide solutions to real problems. The fact that those solutions required sacrifices does not negate their effectiveness. He was not simply a mad scientist, unconcerned with the consequences of his experiments. His work showed evidence of careful planning, of techniques refined across years or decades, of systems designed to continue functioning after he was gone. Whatever drove him, it was not mere chaos or curiosity without direction. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is the most unsatisfying. Alzur was a mage who saw problems and solved them using the techniques available to him, without sufficient regard for whether those techniques respected the humanity of his subjects, but also without evidence that he actively sought to cause suffering for its own sake. He created witchers because monsters needed to be fought, and normal humans were insufficient for the task. The fact that creating witchers required destroying most of the children subjected to the mutations was apparently an acceptable cost for achieving the goal. Not desirable, perhaps. Not celebrated, but acceptable. He created spells because magic was meant to do things, to affect the world, to provide capabilities that would not exist without conscious effort. That some of those spells created problems as severe as the ones they solved might not have been his primary concern. The capability itself was what mattered. He worked within systems. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, royal patronage, master-apprentice relationships with Cosimo Malaspina and Idarran of Ulivo that normalized his approach. He was not an outlier in magical culture. He was simply more successful than most at leaving permanent marks. And those marks remain, centuries after he died. Witchers carrying his legacy forward with every monster they hunt. Mages casting his spells when situations demand. Creatures he may have created still existing in the wild places of the continent. Alzur designed things that should not exist. He brought them into being anyway. The world adapted. For those who seek to understand the world the conjunction created, more such stories wait in the deeper histories and stranger corners where magic and necessity converged. If you found this exploration worthwhile, let others know. The lore runs deep. There is a moment, preserved in accounts from Geralt's journey, where the question becomes unavoidable. Ciri, the child of destiny, carrier of elder blood, survivor of forces that sought to use her for purposes she did not choose, asked Geralt what it means to be a witcher. Not the mechanics, not the capabilities or the contracts, but what it means to exist as something created by others, for others, without having been asked if creation was wanted. The conversation does not resolve cleanly. Geralt does not offer comfortable answers. He cannot, because he carries the same question himself. What does it mean to owe your existence to someone who transformed you without your consent? What does it mean to be grateful for capabilities purchased with the death of those who did not survive alongside you? These questions extend beyond Geralt, beyond any individual witcher. They touch the fundamental problem Alzur created and never solved. Can a system built on the sacrifice of the unwilling be justified by the benefit it provides to others? Philosophers across the centuries the conjunction left behind have grappled with variations of this question. The answers tend to divide along predictable lines. Those who prioritize outcomes point to lives saved. Those who prioritize process point to violations of autonomy. Those who seek middle ground find themselves struggling to weight incommensurable values against each other. But the question persists because the work persists. As long as witchers hunt, as long as Alzur's spells are cast, as long as the consequences of his decisions continue manifesting in the world, the question remains active rather than historical. Perhaps what makes Alzur's legacy particularly difficult to navigate is its completeness. He did not create witchers and then stop. He did not develop defensive magic without also developing offensive capabilities. He did not focus solely on helping humanity without also creating threats that humanity would need to survive. The comprehensiveness of his work means one cannot simply accept the beneficial parts while rejecting the harmful ones. The witchers and the monsters emerge from the same fundamental approach: transformation pushed to extremes, creation without sufficient concern for whether the created things should exist, solutions that generated new problems requiring new solutions. This pattern appears throughout magical history, though rarely at Alzur's scale. Mages create tools that prove dangerous. Sorcerers develop techniques that subsequent generations struggle to control. The pursuit of capability without equivalent attention to consequence is not unique to Alzur. He simply demonstrated it more thoroughly than most. The lesson, if there is one, might be about the persistence of choices. Alzur's decisions 3 centuries before Geralt's time continued determining possibilities in Geralt's era. The Witchers existed because Alzur decided they should exist. They operated in specific ways because Alzur and his collaborators designed those operational parameters. They faced specific hostilities because their creation violated principles that many humans found important even if they could not articulate why. Whether Alzur died in the summoning of the Viy, or lived longer before some other fate claimed him, the sources offer conflicting accounts. Materials from the games, which expand significantly beyond Sapkowski's books, provide a narrative where Alzur perished in Maribor, killed by his own creation. Book sources mention the Viy as a creature that destroyed part of the city, but do not preserve the same level of detail about Alzur's specific involvement or fate. The uncertainty itself reveals how completely the creator's end has been obscured by the endurance of his creations. He did not witness the attack on Kaer. He did not see the last generations of Witchers struggling to maintain traditions that were becoming obsolete. He did not meet Geralt, didn't see what the white-haired Witcher would become, but his decision shaped all of these outcomes. The attack on Kaer Morhen happened because Witchers existed, because they were created through methods that many found abhorrent. The decline of the schools happened because the system Alzur built was never designed for sustainability beyond the immediate need it addressed. Geralt became what he became because he survived mutations that Alzur helped develop. Causation across centuries is complex, mediated by countless intervening factors, but the chain remains traceable. From Alzur's work at Rissberg to the white-haired Witcher hunting monsters in the 13th century, the connection persists. In the deeper archives of Rissberg, according to accounts that may or may not be reliable, fragments of Alzur's notes remain. Not complete records, not systematic documentation of all his work, but pieces. Observations about mutation vectors. Speculations about why certain subjects survived while others failed. Technical details about spell construction that might allow later mages to reconstruct his techniques, even without access to the complete formulas. These fragments exist in a curious state. They are valuable. The knowledge they contain represents centuries of refinement, insights that would take lifetimes to rediscover independently. They are also dangerous. The same knowledge that could advance magical understanding could also be misapplied, creating new disasters that would require intervention. The mages at Rissberg who maintained those archives faced a choice that has no obviously correct answer: preserve the knowledge and risk it being misused, or destroy it and lose insights that might prove crucial in contexts not yet imagined. They chose preservation, apparently. The fragments remained. Whether this decision will ultimately prove wise depends on what later generations do with the knowledge. This mirrors the larger question about Alzur's work. The Witchers, the spells, the monsters, all of these continue existing, continue having effects, continue forcing choices on people who had no say in whether any of it should have been created. Future generations inherit these consequences. They can maintain the systems Alzur built, letting Witchers continue their work until the schools finally die out entirely. They can abandon those systems, accepting the risks that come with having no organized response to monster threats. They can attempt to modify the systems, trying to preserve beneficial aspects while eliminating harmful ones, though such modifications are often more difficult than they appear. None of these choices are cost-free. Each involves trade-offs between competing values: safety versus autonomy, capability versus ethics, present benefit versus long-term consequence. The white-haired Witcher, when asked about destiny, tends toward skepticism. He has reason. His entire existence is the product of choices made by others. Alzur's decisions about Witcher creation, Vesemir's decisions about training, destiny itself claiming him through the law of surprise before he was born. He has spent his life navigating consequences of decisions he did not make, existing as a thing created for purposes he did not choose. If anyone has earned the right to question whether creation justifies its costs, it might be Geralt. But he continues. He takes contracts. He hunts monsters. He uses the capabilities the mutations gave him. He does not rail against Alzur or curse the mages who transformed him. He simply exists, operates within the reality he was given, makes what choices he can within constraints he did not establish. Perhaps this is the most that can be expected. Not acceptance, not rejection, but engagement with reality as it exists rather than as one wishes it might have been. Alzur created a world where children became Witchers, and Witchers hunted monsters, and some of those monsters were created by the same mind that created the hunters. That world persists. The people living in it must navigate its structures regardless of whether they approve of how those structures came to be. In the end, names survive or fade based on what they created. Alzur's name survived because he created things that could not be ignored. Witchers who saved lives while embodying uncomfortable questions about the cost of salvation, spells that remained useful centuries after their inventor died, monsters that terrorized regions even as they demonstrated the limits of magical creation. His legacy is not simple. It cannot be reduced to hero or villain, benefactor or exploiter. He was a mage who saw problems and solved them, who developed capabilities without sufficient attention to whether those capabilities should exist, who built systems that outlived him, and continued demanding responses from people who never chose to inherit them. The mutations worked. The Witchers hunted. The spells proved useful. The monsters eventually declined or disappeared. And the question remains, Should any of it have been created at all? The answer depends on whom you ask, what you value, how you weight the lives saved against the lives spent. There is no consensus. There cannot be, because the values involved do not reduce to simple arithmetic. What exists is Alzur's work, still manifesting centuries later, still shaping possibilities, still demanding that those who inherit it navigate consequences they did not choose. The Witchers hunt, the spells endure, the memory persists, and the world Alzur helped design continues, indifferent to questions about whether it should exist, occupied instead with the simpler problem of surviving within the reality that creation made inevitable. There is a final consideration worth noting. Alzur's work survives in part because Witchers continue to exist. Remove the Witchers from history, and Alzur becomes merely another name in magical texts, creator of some spells, researcher at Rissberg, perhaps a footnote in studies of transformation magic. The Witchers make him impossible to forget. This creates a peculiar dependency. Alzur's legacy relies on the continuation of the very beings whose creation raises the deepest ethical concerns about his work. Every Witcher who survives, who takes contracts, who trains new candidates before the schools finally close, each extends Alzur's presence in the world for another generation. When the last Witcher dies, if that day comes, Alzur's legacy will shift fundamentally. He will become purely historical, no longer present in living form. The questions about whether Witchers should have been created will become academic rather than immediate. The ethical weight will not disappear, but it will transform from an active problem requiring navigation into a historical case study about decisions that cannot be unmade. Some might see this as closure. The experiment that was Witcher creation will have run its course, produced its effects, and concluded. Whatever benefits or harms resulted will be complete, no longer accumulating. Others might see it as loss. The capabilities Witchers provided, their effectiveness against threats that regular humans struggled to address, will disappear. If monsters remain, and some monsters will almost certainly remain, humanity will need new solutions or will need to accept vulnerability that Witchers previously mitigated. The transition from a world with Witchers to a world after Witchers represents a threshold that Alzur's decisions made inevitable. He created beings that could not reproduce naturally, that could only be created through processes too brutal to sustain indefinitely. The Witcher schools were always temporary, whether by design or by accident. Their decline was built into their structure from the beginning. Perhaps this was mercy of a sort. Alzur created a solution to a specific historical problem, monsters after the conjunction, and that solution was designed to fade when the problem itself faded. Witchers were never meant to be permanent features of human society. They were meant to address a crisis, and when the crisis passed, they would pass as well. Or perhaps it was simply failure to plan for sustainability. A system that requires killing most of its candidates to produce survivors cannot maintain itself once public tolerance for that mortality rate declines. The Witchers were always living on borrowed time, existing because the need was desperate enough to justify methods that would become unacceptable once the desperation eased. Either way, the end approaches. Fewer Witchers train, fewer schools operate. The knowledge of how to perform the mutations has been lost in some places, is being deliberately not transmitted in others. Within a few more generations, there may be no one left who remembers how to create a Witcher, even if someone wanted to try. And then Alzur's most significant creation will have passed entirely into history, survived only by the spells that bear his name and the fragmentary records of what he did. The monsters he created, the Viy, the Idars, the koshcheys, are already mostly gone, extinct or nearly so. The mutations he developed will follow them into extinction. What will remain are the spells, the knowledge that transformation is possible, and the memory of a mage who looked at human children and saw raw material for something else. Whether that memory deserves preservation or condemnation, each generation will decide for itself. The facts remain fixed: what Alzur did, what resulted, what cost was paid. The interpretation of those facts continues to evolve as contexts change and new ethical frameworks emerge. In the deepest sense, this is what it means to create at Alzur's scale. The creation persists beyond the creator's control, beyond the creator's ability to clarify intent or defend choices. It becomes something that others must navigate, interpret, use, or reject. Based on their own needs and their own values, Alzur built systems. Those systems operated for centuries. They are now declining toward their end. What comes after, whether humanity finds new ways to address monster threats, whether the threats themselves finally fade to manageable levels, whether the absence of witchers proves catastrophic or barely noticeable, will itself become part of Alzur's legacy. Consequences he could not have predicted, but that trace back to his decisions nonetheless. The chain of causation continues. The questions persist. And the work, what remains of it, what survives in spell and memory, and the last few witchers still walking the path, endures a while longer before it too passes into the history that waits to receive all things, however brutally created, however necessary they seemed in their moment.